Standing 500 feet above the churning river, the wind screaming in my ears, my boss Mason Lewis handed me a termination notice. He thought firing the expensive old guy would save his quarterly budget. He didn't realize I was the sole legal signatory for the heavy lift crane permits. As I walked off the deck, I didn't argue. I just started a stopwatch. The silence that followed would cost him $60 million. The wind on the Columbia River Gorge doesn't just blow, it hunts. At 500 feet up, standing on the skeletal steel of the new interstate bridge, the gusts felt like physical blows, hammering against my safety harness with the force of a prize fighter. It was 6:45 a.m. The sun was just bleeding over the horizon, painting the river far below in shades of gunmetal and bruised purple. My breath plumed in the freezing air as I checked the tension on the main cable stay. "Load chart looks good, Jack," Mikey shouted over the wind. Mikey was 22, green as spring grass, but he had good hands and he listened. That was rare these days. "Check it again," I said, my voice gravelly from 30 years of shouting over diesel engines. "The wind shear is picking up. If that gauge hits 30 miles per hour, we shut down the lift. No exceptions." "Copy that, boss," Mikey said, adjusting his hard hat. I wasn't the boss in the corporate sense. I was the lead rigger. On paper, that meant I was responsible for attaching the loads to the cranes. In reality, it meant I was the god of gravity on this job site. Nothing moved, not a beam, not a bucket of bolts, not a generator, unless I signed off on the physics. I carried 3 separate federal certifications that took me 2 decades to acquire. I adjusted my tool belt, feeling the familiar weight of my spud wrench and drift pins. I loved this job. I loved the terrifying height, the smell of ozone and welding flux, and the absolute undeniable truth of steel. Steel didn't lie. It didn't play politics. If you respected it, it held. If you disrespected it, you died. Mason Lewis, however, respected nothing but his bonus structure. I saw him coming before I heard him. He was walking along the temporary catwalk, his pristine white hard hat shining like a beacon. His boots were suspiciously clean for a bridge site in November. He was 32 years old, had an MBA from somewhere expensive, and had been on the site for exactly 3 weeks. He was already checking his watch. "Reynolds," he barked as he got closer. "Why isn't the main truss moving? We have a timeline." The concrete pour scheduled for noon. I didn't turn around immediately. I finished inspecting the shackle pin, ensuring the cotter pin was fully spread. Only then did I face him. "Wind is gusting at 28, Mason," I said, pointing to the anemometer mounted on the crane boom. "Federal safety limit is 30. We're in the yellow zone. We wait until it settles." Mason scoffed, a sound that was snatched away by the gale. "It's a breeze, Jack. A breeze. We are 2 weeks behind schedule because of your safety pauses. Corporate is breathing down my neck. I need that truss set in place by 9:00 a.m. I looked at the truss in question. It was a 40-ton section of prefabricated steel. If the wind caught it wrong while it was suspended, it wouldn't just be a piece of metal, it would be a battering ram capable of taking out the crane tower and anyone standing near it. "Physics doesn't care about your schedule, Mason," I said calmly. "We wait." Mason stepped into my personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. "I'm the project manager. I give the orders. You lift the damn truss." I looked him dead in the eye. "And I'm the certified master rigger. If I say it's unsafe, the crane doesn't move. That's federal law. You want to lift it? You climb up in the cab and pull the lever yourself. But I won't sign the manifest." Mason's face turned a shade of red that matched the warning lights on the crane. He hated me. I knew it. I was a relic to him, an expensive obstacle standing between him and his completion bonus. He didn't know that I was actually the only thing keeping his project from collapsing into the river. The argument simmered for an hour. The wind refused to die down, hovering tantalizingly around 29 miles per hour. The entire crew, 60 men and women, stood around drinking coffee, stomping their feet to stay warm. That was 60 hourly wages being paid for zero work. I could feel Mason's eyes boring into the back of my jacket. He was pacing back and forth on the steel decking, furiously typing on his phone. At 8:15 a.m., the wind spiked. A gust hit 40 miles per hour, rattling the safety chains and making the porta-potty strapped to the deck shudder. "That's it," I called out to the crane operator over the radio. "Shut it down, Jimmy. Lock the boom. We're grounded until this passes." Copy, Jack, Jimmy replied, sounding relieved. No operator likes fighting the wind. Mason snapped. He marched over to me, phone in hand. You did that on purpose, he spat. I don't control the weather, Mason, I said, wiping grit from my eyes. I just react to it so your wife doesn't get a folded flag handed to her. I am sick of your attitude, Reynolds, Mason shouted, his voice cracking. I've looked at the payroll. Do you know how much you cost this company? You're making 3 times what the junior Rickers make, and all you do is stand here and tell me, no. You pay me for what I know, not what I do, I said, crossing my arms. And right now, I know that if we lift, people die. I can find 10 guys willing to make this lift right now, Mason yelled, gesturing to the crew. Then go find them, I challenged. But none of them can legally sign the load chart. Without a level 4 certification signature, the insurance is void. You know that. Mason smiled then. It was a nasty, tight little smile. The insurance is void if we have an accident. But if we don't have an accident, nobody looks at the paperwork, do they? I went cold. He wasn't just arrogant. He was dangerous. I'm not bypassing protocol, Mason. Not for you. Not for anyone. Then you're obstructing the project, Mason said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. I have the authority to remove obstructionists. I checked with HR this morning. California is an at-will employment state, and your contract has a loophole for insubordination. The crew had gone silent. Even Mikey had stopped organizing the chains. They were all watching. Are you threatening me? I asked quietly. I'm giving you a choice, Jack, Mason said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. You signal to lift right now, or you take this. He held out the paper. It was a termination notice. He had prepared it beforehand. He had come up here looking for a fight. I looked at the swaying crane cables. I looked at the white caps on the river 500 feet below. Then I looked at Mason, a man who had never tightened a bolt in his life. It's blowing 40, I said. I'm not lifting. Then you're fired, Mason said, shoving the paper against my chest. Get off my bridge, right now. For a moment, the only sound was the howling wind. Mikey stepped forward, looking terrified. Jack, I held up a hand to stop him. I took the paper from Mason. I didn't crumble it. I didn't throw a punch. I folded it neatly and placed it in my inner pocket. You're making a mistake, Mason, I said. My voice was steady, which seemed to infuriate him more. The only mistake was not firing you 3 weeks ago, Mason sneered. Hand over your radio and your badge. Security will escort you to the gate. I unclipped the radio from my shoulder and placed it on a stack of I-beams. I took off my badge, the one with Sightsee but Lee printed in bold letters, and laid it next to the radio. Good luck, I said. I don't need luck, Mason replied, turning his back on me to shout at the crew. All right, listen up. Reynolds is gone. We're moving. Eddie, you're on rigging. Get that truss in the air. Eddie, a decent kid but barely a level 2, looked at me with wide eyes. I gave him a subtle shake of the head. Don't do it, kid. Eddie looked at Mason. Mr. Lewis, I can't. I'm not certified for a 40-ton dual pick. Only Jack is. I don't care about the certification, Mason screamed. Book it up! I walked over to the gang box where I kept my personal gear. I moved methodically. I packed my custom harness, my calibrated tension gauges, and my laser levels. These weren't company tools, they were mine, bought and paid for over a career of hard labor. As I packed, I felt a strange sense of calm washing over me. Mason had focused so hard on the payroll and the timeline that he had forgotten to read the fine print of the site permits. I picked up my bag and slung it over my shoulder. I walked past Mason, who was currently berating the crane operator over the radio. Jack, Mikey whispered as I passed him. What are we going to do? I paused and looked at the kid. You're going to stay safe, Mikey. If he forces that lift, you walk off. You hear me? No job is worth your life. But the project, Mikey said. The project is dead, I said, loud enough for Mason to hear, though he pretended not to. He just doesn't know it yet. I began the long walk down the temporary scaffolding stairs. 500 feet of descent. With every step, I formulated the plan. Mason thought he had just cut costs. He thought he had removed a stubborn old man. What he had actually done was trigger the key personnel clause in the project's master liability policy. I knew this because 10 years ago I had helped write the industry standard for it, by firing me without a replacement of equal certification on site. Mason had legally rendered the construction site inactive the moment I stepped off the property. I reached the bottom of the tower and walked toward the security gate. I handed my swipe card to the guard, old man Jenkins. "Heading out early, Jack?" Jenkins asked, confused. "Heading out for good, Jenkins," I said. "Do me a favor. Note the exact time I leave in the logbook. To the minute." Sure, Jack. It's 8:52 a.m. 8:52 a.m., I repeated. I walked to my truck, a beat-up Ford F-150 that had seen as many job sites as I had. I threw my gear in the back. As I started the engine, I looked up at the bridge one last time. The crane wasn't moving. The truss was still sitting on the deck. Even Mason couldn't force the laws of physics to bend, and he certainly couldn't force a crane operator to lose his license for an illegal lift. I pulled out my phone. I didn't call my wife and I didn't call a lawyer. Not yet. I opened my contacts and scrolled down to H. Hill. Connor. I hit dial. It rang twice. "Jack?" Connor's voice came through, crisp and sharp. "I haven't heard from you since the VA picnic. Everything okay?" "Mason Lewis just fired me," I said, putting the truck in gear. There was a pause on the line. "The nephew, the one running the Columbia River job, that's the one. He fired the only level 4 rigger on the seaboard." Connor actually laughed. There was a dry, humorless sound. "Does he know about the bond requirements?" "He's about to find out," I said, pulling onto the highway. "I need you to do your thing, Connor. I want to make sure that when the state finds out, there's nowhere for him to hide." "I'm opening the file now," Connor said. "Go home, Jack. Pour a drink. By tomorrow morning, that bridge is going to be the most expensive lawn ornament in the state." I drove away, leaving the bridge in the rearview mirror. I had been fired, humiliated, and escorted off the site I had dedicated 2 years to building. But as I merged onto the interstate, I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready. Mason wanted a war? He was about to find out that you don't fight a man who builds fortresses for a living. My house was too quiet. After 30 years of spending my days surrounded by the roar of diesel generators, the scream of impact wrenches, and the shouting of men, the silence of my living room felt heavy. It was 10:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. I should have been 500 feet in the air, orchestrating a ballet of steel and gravity. Instead, I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at a lukewarm cup of coffee and a 3-inch thick binder I called the Bible. My daughter Grace walked in a few minutes later. She had a key, of course, but she usually didn't drop by during work hours. She took one look at me sitting there in my flannel shirt, my work boots unlaced by the door, and knew. "He did it, didn't he?" she asked, dropping her bag on the counter. Grace was 28, a data analyst for a logistics firm. She had my stubbornness and her mother's brains. "Fired me on the catwalk," I said, taking a sip of the coffee. "Insubordination." Grace let out a sharp laugh. "Insubordination?" Grace let out a sharp laugh. "Insubordination? You're the only reason that site hasn't turned into a nightly news tragedy." She sat down opposite me, pulling the binder closer. "So, what's the play, Dad? You're not just going to take unemployment and fade away." "No," I said, tapping the binder. "I'm going to let the fine print do the heavy lifting." I flipped the binder open to page 402. It was a section of the master service agreement between the construction firm and the State Department of Transportation. It was dense legalese, the kind of stuff Mason Lewis probably skimmed over while looking for the bonus clauses. "Read paragraph 4, subsection B," I said. Grace adjusted her glasses and read aloud. "Stipulation of key personnel. Due to the high-risk nature of the cantilever construction, the lead rigger must maintain a Level 4 federal certification and be specifically named on the catastrophic liability insurance policy. Removal of said personnel without a pre-approved, equally certified replacement triggers an immediate suspension of the surety bond." She looked up, her eyes widening. "The surety bond. That's the insurance that allows them to operate on state land, right?" "Exactly," I said, leaning back. "No bond, no permit, no BERT, no work. By firing me without having another Level 4 rigger on site, and there are only 3 of us in the state, and the other 2 are retired. Mason didn't just fire an employee. He legally invalidated the construction site's right to exist." "Does he know?" Grace asked. "He thinks I'm just a guy in a hard hat," I replied. "He thinks he can just call a temp agency. He has no idea that the moment I clocked out at 8:52 a.m., The insurance carrier's automated system flagged the roster change. The clock is already ticking. I looked at the phone on the table. It had been silent so far. Mason was likely still screaming at the crew, trying to bully someone else into making the lift. But soon, maybe in an hour, maybe two, a fax would land on his desk from the insurance company in Hartford. And then the silence in my kitchen would be nothing compared to the silence on that bridge. "What about the crew?" Grace asked softly. She knew I cared about them. "They get union pay for standby time," I said. "They'll be fine for a week or two." "But Mason?" "Mason is about to learn that you can't bully an insurance contract." Connor Hill didn't look like a fixer. He looked like a high school algebra teacher who ran marathons on the weekends. He was wiry, wore rimless glasses, and spoke in a voice that rarely rose above a conversational hum. But I had served with Connor in the Army Corps of Engineers 20 years ago. I knew that behind those glasses was a mind that understood structural failure better than anyone I'd ever met, both in buildings and in people. He arrived at my house at noon, carrying a tablet and a bag of bagels. "I checked the state database," Connor said before he even said hello. He laid the tablet on the table next to my binder. The notification went out at 11:15 a.m. "The Department of Transportation has already flagged the project status to suspended pending review." "Fast," I said. "Government moves fast when liability is involved," Connor said, sitting down. "So, Mason Lewis, I made some calls. He's the nephew of the CEO, Holloway. He was transferred here from a failed mall project in Arizona. Rumor has it he cut corners there too, but Uncle Holloway swept it under the rug. He wanted me to lift a 40-ton truss in 40-mile-an-hour winds," I said. Connor's face tightened. "That's not cutting corners, Jack. That's criminal negligence." He tapped the screen of his tablet. "Here's the thing. Since the site is now officially suspended, the state is required to conduct a preservation inventory. Basically, they need to ensure the half-built bridge doesn't fall down while it sits there for months. And they need an independent auditor to lead that inventory." Connor smiled, a shark-like expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I still have my credentials as a forensic structural engineer. I can petition the state to appoint me as the auditor. If Mason tries to restart work without you, I'll be there to red tag every single bolt he tightens." "You think there's more than just the wind issue?" I asked. I had been suspicious of Mason's urgency. He was too desperate, too frantic about the timeline. A guy like that doesn't risk a catastrophic crane collapse just to save a few hours, Connor mused. He was trying to bury something. He wanted that truss up and the concrete poured fast. Why? What is he covering up inside the pylons? I thought about the delivery trucks I'd seen lately. Unmarked flatbeds coming in at night. "He's been sourcing materials from a new vendor," I said. "Steel rebar. He said it was a logistical expedited partner. I never saw the mill certificates." Connor pulled a notebook from his pocket. "If the steel is bad, Jack, this isn't just a wrongful termination suit. This is a federal crime. If I get on that site as the auditor, I can test the metal. If it's substandard, Mason Lewis goes to prison." "Do it," I said. "Get on that site. Burn him down." The text message from Mikey came at 2:30 p.m. "It's over. State police just rolled up. They're putting chains on the gates." I was sitting on my back porch, watching the wind rustle the dry leaves in the yard. I could imagine the scene perfectly. The confusion, the flashing lights, the sudden realization that the party was over. According to Mikey, who called me 10 minutes later, hiding in the cab of his pickup truck, it had been glorious. "You should have seen his face, Jack," Mikey said, his voice buzzing with adrenaline. "Mason was up on the deck screaming at the crane operator to override the safety lockout. Then these two state troopers and a guy in a suit from the bonding agency just walked up the ramp." "What did Mason do?" I asked. "He tried the big time then," Mikey laughed. "He started yelling about how he's the project manager and he orders them off the site. The suit just handed him a red envelope, a stop work order. Mason threw it on the ground. The trooper told him if he didn't pick it up, he'd be arrested for littering and obstruction." "Did they clear the bridge?" "Yeah." "Everyone is sent home. Gates are locked. Power to the cranes is cut. It's a ghost town, Jack. The foreman told us to take our tools because we might not be back for a while." "Good," I said. "Stay home, Mikey. Don't answer Mason's calls." "He's already calling," Mikey said. "He left me a voicemail saying if I don't come back and run the rigging, I'm fired too." "But he can't fire me if the site is closed, right?" "He can't do anything," I assured him. He's not in charge anymore. The insurance adjusters are. I hung up the phone and looked out at the horizon. I had stopped the work. I had saved the lives of my crew. But I knew Mason Lewis. He wasn't the type to accept defeat. He was the type to double down. My phone rang again. It wasn't Mikey this time. It was an unknown number. I answered it, putting it on speaker. Reynolds. It was Mason. His voice was trembling with suppressed rage. "This is Jack," I said calmly. "You think you're clever," Mason hissed. "You think some paperwork loophole is going to stop me. I'm going to bury you. I have lawyers who will make sure you never work in this industry again." "I don't need lawyers, Mason," I said. "I have the bond clause. You need a level 4 rigger. There isn't another one available until next spring. You're frozen." "I'll find one," Mason swore. "I'll find one in from China if I have to. And when I do, I'm going to sue you for every dime of lost productivity." "You do that," I said. "But Mason, while you're looking for a rigger, you might want to worry about the audit." "What audit?" Mason snapped. "The state preservation audit," I lied effortlessly, channeling Connor's confidence. "They check everything when a site freezes, every invoice, every shipment of steel, every mill certificate." There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that confirmed everything Connor had suspected. "You're bluffing," Mason whispered. "Pack your warm clothes, Mason," I said. "It's going to be a long winter." I hung up. The bridge was silent. But the war had just begun. The first month of the shutdown hit the project like a hammer. But it was the silence that did the real damage. A construction site is a living organism. It needs movement, noise, and progress to survive. Without it, the equipment starts to die. Batteries drain, hydraulic seals crack in the cold, and morale rots faster than wet lumber. I spent my days in my workshop, restoring an old motorcycle, but my mind is always on the river. I drove past the site occasionally, parking on the public access road a mile away. Through my binoculars, I could see the cranes standing like frozen sentinels, their booms locked in the stowage position against the winter gales. The bridge deck, only halfway finished, looked like a severed limb. Connor kept me updated. He had successfully petitioned the State Oversight Committee and was now the lead auditor for the site preservation. He was strangling Mason Lewis with red tape, demanding inspection reports for every weld and bolt before any work could theoretically resume. "He's bleeding cash, Jack," Connor told me over coffee at my kitchen table one rainy afternoon. "The equipment rental alone is running $50,000 a day, plus the penalties for the schedule slippage." I heard corporate HQ in Chicago was screaming. "Has Holloway called?" I asked. Mr. Holloway, the CEO, was the only man Mason seemed to fear. "Not yet," Connor said. "Mason is shielding him, sending reports that the delay is due to unforeseen geological instability and labor disputes. He's lying to his own uncle to buy time." "Time for what?" Grace asked. She was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by printouts of shipping manifests she had scraped from the public project database. "If he's just waiting for a new rigger, why isn't he interviewing anyone?" "Because no one will take the job," I said with a grim satisfaction. "The union rep put out a do not refer notice. Any rigger who crosses that picket line knows I'll have their certification pulled for safety violations the second they step on site." A DELF, a highlighted spreadsheet. "I think it's more than that. Look at this steel order." Mason authorized a purchase of 300 tons of number 6 rebar from a supplier called Apex Global in October. "I've never heard of them," I said. "We use domestic mills. Bethlehem or Nucor." "Exactly," Grace said. "Apex is a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. But here's the kicker. The shipping weight on the manifest doesn't match the volume. If this was high-grade American steel, it should weigh 10% more. This stuff is lighter." I looked at Connor. His eyes narrowed behind his glasses. "Impurities," Connor whispered. "High carbon content. It's cheap, brittle, and it rusts from the inside out." "If he put that steel inside the concrete pylons," I said, a cold knot forming in my stomach, "and we're sitting here letting it soak in the winter rain for months." "Then the bridge isn't just paused," Connor finished. "It's a ticking time bomb." The call came at 2:14 a.m. I was awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain hammer against the roof. The house felt too big and too empty, a feeling I usually kept at bay with exhaustion from work. Now, with too much sleep and too much thinking, the anxiety was creeping in. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, expecting a wrong number or a robocall. "Jack?" The voice was a harsh whisper, barely audible over background noise. Eddie? I sat up, switching on the lamp. What's wrong? Are you okay? I'm at the site, Eddie whispered. I left my good socket set in the gang box. I hopped the fence to get it because I have a side job tomorrow. Eddie, get out of there, I said sharply. If security catches you, it's trespassing. Mason will press charges. There's no security, Jack, Eddie said, his voice trembling. That's why I'm calling. The guard shack is empty. Jenkins isn't here. But there are trucks. Down by the laydown yard, no headlights, just parking lights. My grip on the phone tightened. What kind of trucks? Flatbeds. And a mobile crane. But it's not one of ours. It's an unbranded rental. They're moving the rebar bundles, Jack. The ones with the red tags. The red tag bundles were the ones Grace had identified. The Apex Global steel. They're swapping it, I realized aloud. Mason knows the audit is coming. He knows Connor is going to test the metal. He's trying to switch the cheap stuff for compliant steel before we get there. They're loading it fast, Eddie said. Jack, Mason is down there. I can see him. He's helping them strap the loads. He looks frantic. Eddie, listen to me very carefully, I said, my voice steady. Do not let them see you. Do not try to be a hero. I want you to take your phone, turn off the flash, and take a video. Get the license plates of the trucks. Get Mason's face if you can. Then get over the fence and run. Okay, I'm doing it. I heard the fumble of the phone, then a few seconds of heavy breathing. Got it, Eddie whispered. One of the trucks is leaving. Jack, they aren't taking the steel away. They're dumping it. Dumping it where? The river, Eddie said. They're driving onto the temporary barge ramp and pushing the bundles into the deep channel. They're drowning the evidence. I felt a surge of rage so pure it nearly blinded me. Pollution, fraud, destruction of evidence. Mason wasn't just a bad boss, he was a criminal. Get out of there, Eddie, I commanded. Send me the video when you're safe. Go. The line went dead. I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart pounding. Mason was destroying the proof. If that steel was at the bottom of the Columbia River, we couldn't test it. He could claim it was stolen or lost, but he had made a fatal error. He had forgotten that steel, even at the bottom of a river, tells a story. And he had forgotten that I knew every inch of that riverbed. 2 days later, Mason Lewis came to my house. It was a Saturday morning. I was in the driveway washing the mud off my truck. I saw his silver BMW turn onto my street, looking out of place among the pickup trucks and minivans of my neighborhood. He pulled into my driveway and got out. He looked terrible. The arrogance that had defined him on the catwalk was gone, replaced by gray skin, dark circles under his eyes, and a suit that looked like he'd slept in it. I didn't turn off the hose. I just stood there, watching him walk up. Jack, he said, forcing a smile that looked like a grimace. Beautiful morning. You're trespassing, Mason, I said calmly. I just want to talk, he said, holding up his hands. Off the record. Man to man. We aren't men to you, I said. We're line items. Mason flinched, but kept coming. He stopped 5 feet away, eyeing the hose in my hand like it was a weapon. Look, things have gotten complicated, Mason said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the chill. This shutdown, the audit, it's hurting everyone. The crew is out of work. The community is suffering. Don't pretend you care about the crew, I said. You fired me to save a bonus. You froze the project because you were too arrogant to follow the law. I made a mistake, Mason said quickly. I admit it. I should have listened to you about the wind. You're right. You're the best rigger in the state. Everyone says so. He reached into his jacket pocket. For a second, I tensed, remembering the termination notice, but he pulled out a checkbook. I want to hire you back, Jack, as an independent consultant, to oversee the inventory to help us get the bond reinstated. He scribbled on a check and tore it out. He held it toward me. I looked at the number. It was for $50,000. That's just the signing bonus, Mason said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. There's another one waiting when the audit is cleared. All you have to do is come back on site, sign the retroactive safety logs for the last 3 months, and tell the auditor, tell your friend Connor that the material inventory is accurate. I looked at the check. It was more money than I made in 6 months. It could pay off my truck. It could help Grace with her student loans. I looked at Mason. He was shaking. He wasn't offering me a job. He was asking me to become an accomplice. He wanted me to validate the steel he had dumped in the river. I took the check from his hand. Mason let out a breath, his shoulders sagging in relief. Thank you, Jack. I knew you were reasonable. I tore the check in half. Then I tore it again. I let the pieces flutter down into the muddy water running down the driveway. You can buy cheap steel, Mason, I said, my voice low and hard, but you can't buy me. Mason stared at the confetti on the ground. His face twisted. The fear vanished, replaced by the ugly, cornered rat look I had seen on the bridge. You're making a mistake, he hissed. You think you can take me down? I'm a Lewis. My family owns this town. Your family owns a construction company, I corrected him. But right now, the river owns your steel, and I know exactly where you dumped it. Mason went pale. He stumbled back a step. I don't know what you're talking about. Get off my property, I said, turning the hose nozzle back on, before I washed the trash down the driveway myself. Mason ran to his car. As he peeled out, tires screeching, I knew the end game was approaching. He knew that I knew, and a desperate man is a dangerous man. The arrival of a federal investigator is not like on TV. There are no sirens, no SWAT teams jumping out of vans. It's quieter and infinitely more terrifying for a man like Mason Lewis. It happened on a Tuesday, 3 days after Mason had tried to bribe me. The sun was finally breaking through the gray cloud cover, illuminating the dormant construction site. The silence that had hung over the bridge for months was broken by the sound of 3 black SUVs rolling through the main gate. I was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against the bed of my truck. Connor was standing next to me holding a thick file folder. Beside us stood Eddie, looking pale but determined. Mason came running out of the site trailer, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked like a man trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. What is this? Mason shouted as a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the lead SUV. This is a closed site. You can't just drive in here. The man ignored him. He walked straight over to us. He wore a navy blue windbreaker with yellow lettering on the back. Jack Reynolds? He asked. That's me, I said. Agent Nelson. Federal Infrastructure Investigation Division. He shook my hand with a grip like a bench vise. We received the affidavit from your associate, Mr. Hill, and the video evidence from the witness. He nodded at Eddie. Mason froze. Video? What video? Agent Nelson turned to Mason slowly. Mr. Lewis, I presume? We have footage of you supervising the illegal disposal of construction materials into a navigable waterway. That's an EPA violation for starters. But we're more interested in why you dumped it. We were cleaning the laydown yard, Mason stammered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. Just scrap metal, old rusted rebar. That's funny, Connor interjected, his voice calm and deadly. Because the manifest says that scrap was the shipment of high-tensile steel intended for the North Pylon. Why throw away 300 tons of brand new steel, Mason? It was defective, Mason lied. We were disposing of it safely. By throwing it in the river? Nelson asked, raising an eyebrow. At 2:00 a.m.? Mason opened his mouth, but no words came out. We have a dive team en route, Nelson said, checking his watch. They're going to pull a sample from the riverbed, and then we're going to test it against the steel you actually installed in the South Pylon before the shutdown. You can't drill into the pylon, Mason said, his voice shrill. It'll compromise the structural integrity. The integrity is already compromised, Mason, I said, stepping forward, because you didn't just dump the steel to hide it. You dumped it because you realized that sitting in the rain for 8 months exposed the truth. Cheap steel doesn't just rust, Mason. It bleeds. Mason looked at me with pure hatred. But behind the hate was the hollow look of a man watching his life implode. Open the gates, Nelson ordered his team. We're going to work. The dive team recovered 3 bundles of rebar within 2 hours. It wasn't hard. Eddie knew exactly where they had pushed them off the barge ramp. When the crane hoisted the dripping, mud-caked steel onto the bank, the silence was absolute. Even from 20 feet away, I could see it. The steel was pitted, flaking, and orange. High-grade American rebar develops a surface patina of rust that actually protects the metal. This was rot. Connor walked up to the bundle with a spectrometer. He scanned the metal, the machine beeping softly. He looked at the readout, then looked at Agent Nelson. Carbon content is through the roof, Connor announced. Manganese is practically non-existent. This is recycled scrap remelt, likely from a non-regulated foundry. It has about 60% of the tensile strength required by the bridge design. Agent Nelson nodded, his face grim. And this is what's inside the concrete of the South Tower. We need to verify, Connor said. We moved to the south pylon, the massive concrete pillar that anchored the bridge to the shore. Mason was following us like a ghost, flanked by 2 federal agents. He wasn't in handcuffs yet, but he wasn't free to leave. Connor set up an ultrasonic testing rig against the concrete face of the pylon. He applied the coupling gel and ran the transducer over the surface. "Jack, come look at this," Connor said quietly. I looked at the screen. The sound waves were bouncing back erratically. "Delamination," I said, pointing to the jagged lines. "The steel inside is expanding. It's the rust jacking," Connor explained for Nelson's benefit. "That cheap steel has been sitting inside this concrete for 8 months, absorbing moisture from the uncured mix in the winter rain. It's rusting at an accelerated rate. As it rusts, it expands. It's pushing the concrete apart from the inside out." "What does that mean for the bridge?" Nelson asked. I turned to look at the massive structure towering above us. "It means it's dead," I said. "If we had finished this bridge, if I hadn't stopped the work and let it sit, this corrosion would have happened silently over the next 5 years. Then, one day, under a heavy load of traffic, a snap. A black limousine pulled up to the police tape at the edge of the site. A man in a wool coat stepped out. It was Mr. Holloway, the CEO. He had flown back from Europe. He walked under the tape, ignoring the mud ruining his Italian shoes. He looked at the rusted steel on the bank. He looked at the ultrasonic reading. Then he looked at his nephew. "Mason," Holloway said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried more weight than the crane. "Did you authorize the Apex Global purchase?" "Uncle Arthur, I saved us $2 million, Mason pleaded. "The margins were tight. I thought it would hold." "You thought physics would negotiate with you?" Holloway asked, his voice trembling with fury. "You didn't save us money. You just bankrupted this company. This entire pylon has to be demolished. The foundation has to be dug out. We have to start from zero." "Mr. Holloway," Agent Nelson interrupted, "I'm going to need your records, and I'm placing Mr. Mistreat Lewis under arrest for fraud, gross negligence, and environmental violations." As the agents moved in to cuff Mason, he looked at me one last time. "You've ruined everything," he screamed, as they dragged him toward the SUV. "No, Mason," I said, though he couldn't hear me. "I just made sure the only thing that collapsed was your career." 6 months later, I sat on the tailgate of my truck, parked on the access road by the river. It was a warm June evening. The air smelled of honeysuckle and diesel. The view had changed. The south pylon was gone, reduced to rubble by a controlled demolition crew last month. The bridge was gone. The river flowed uninterrupted, the scars of Mason's ambition washed away by the current. It was a total restart. Holloway's firm had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, restructured, and settled the lawsuits. Mason was awaiting trial, facing 10 to 15 years in federal prison. But the bridge still needed to be built. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the new general contractor, a reputable firm from Seattle. Subject contract confirmation. Lead rigger and safety director. They had hired me back, not just as a rigger, but as the director of safety for the entire rebuild. My salary had doubled. And the first person I hired was Mikey, who is now a level 3 apprentice on the fast track. Connor had gone back to his consulting firm, his reputation legendary in the industry as the man who caught the rust bridge. I took a sip of iced tea and looked at the empty space where the bridge would be. It would be built right this time. American steel, proper permits. And no one, absolutely no one, would sign a load chart unless I said it was safe. The life twist wasn't that I got my job back. It was that the 8 months delay, the firing, the struggle, it was the only thing that saved the town. If Mason hadn't fired me, I might have caught the bad steel too late. His arrogance was the very thing that triggered the safety mechanism that destroyed him. You know, people ask me if I regret pushing back that day, if I regret losing my income for half a year just to prove a point. Here's the thing about just following orders. It works fine until gravity enters the chat. I made the mistake early on of thinking my experience demanded respect. It doesn't. In the corporate world, experience is just a line item that costs money. I also trusted that the system would catch a guy like Mason sooner. It didn't. Systems are run by people, and people can be bullied. I learned that your no is your most valuable asset. The power to stop work isn't about being difficult. It's about being the final line of defense. I learned that bad bosses rely on your fear of poverty to make you compliant. And I learned that physics, like the truth, always comes out in the end, usually violently. If you're in a high-stakes job, construction, medical, finance, listen to me. If you were told to do something unsafe, send an email. Per our conversation, I am confirming you ordered X, despite my safety warning Y. If they won't put it in writing, you don't do it. I knew the certification clause. Read your contracts. Know the laws that govern your industry better than your boss does. That fine print is your shield. Don't wait until you're fired to call your allies. Keep in touch with the Connors in your life. You never know when you'll need a forensic engineer or a lawyer. Mason Lewis thought he could cheat the river. He thought he could cheat me. But the river always wins. If the story of justice touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay safe and check your rigging.